Hi. Now we're going to talk about Chapter 10 with conflict. Now, Chapter 9, we covered a great deal more territory that's important for sometimes avoiding conflict or keeping it from happening, right? Or certainly reducing defensiveness and handling criticism. So those things can help you deal with problems before it becomes a full-blown conflict. Now, we're going to talk about what the book says somewhat, and then we're also going to talk about extra notes that I've given to you, and some that have to do with the exercise on conflict management styles. And those 5 management styles are the ones that are taught most commonly in conflict management. So what I want to do is kind of talk through the chapter some so you can see how the chapter also works with those conflict management styles that we're using. And hopefully you've already taken a look at those notes. If not, make sure you have a copy handy with you, so that will be helpful. So your textbook gives a statement for conflict, which is that it's defined as a struggle between 2 different persons' ideas or interests. So that's a common definition from a dictionary. And certainly we think of conflict in that way. But we know that, and when they go through their different levels of conflict, it's clear, right, how they use that definition. So we'll look at that briefly. But I do want to add this other definition of conflict, because it's the conflicts that are much more difficult to handle, more complex, where we can find this definition useful. All right, so conflict, right, is an expressed struggle between at least 2 interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving their goals. Now, I will use some, because this is, I'm sure, foremost in many people's minds, the ideas of conflict as far as the pandemic is concerned. We certainly can see this conflict idea played out in a number of ways in a number of different levels and places. So let's look at this definition first. An expressed struggle. The problem is, if you don't express that you have a conflict with another party, then it actually isn't a conflict, because you've already chosen to either avoid or simply not deal with it or recognize it or make your needs known. So the burden is on the party who really has the issue. Okay, otherwise people may just go ahead and do what they think is best. So it has to be an expressed struggle that has to be expressed, that you have these incompatible goals, etc. So we'll get back to that. 2 interdependent parties. Well, kind of obviously, if it's not a relationship that requires working together, that has to be accomplished, then it isn't really a conflict so much. It's interdependent. Somehow you affect each other. Each party affects the other. And so that's why the decisions in a conflict, right, would be expressed and need to be dealt with. So they have to be interdependent. Who perceive. Now, sometimes we perceive incompatible goals, and as we start to work on a situation, we find out, well, actually, we could figure something out. Okay? So, we have, we perceive incompatible goals. In other words, what one party's trying to get, what the other party's trying to get, are so opposite from each other. There's no way everybody can have what they want. So we perceive that, at least. Scarce resources, not enough of the resource to go around. And that could be many kinds of things. As far as it can be financial, right? It can also be time, right? Time and energy, focus, or actual things like food, all right? Or other things that we've talked about even in Maslow's hierarchy as far as needs are concerned. What are those resources we're looking at? And interference from the other party. In other words, you're going to be struggling with each other over these resources and incompatible goals. So we have seen this played out in many, many different ways as COVID-19, as a pandemic has caused many kinds of conflicts between different parties, even within our own country. For example, different states having to bid against each other for personal protective equipment. I mean, that's a conflict, and how are you going to proceed with a strategy to resolve that conflict? And so we've seen this. I just want you to be thinking about it and look at these different struggles and think about what you've observed about the many conflicts, not just one, but many, many conflicts that are being played out, have been played out, and will continue to play out in different ways. All right, so what I want you to see from that too is that when you look at conflict in that way, it is at a higher level, right, when that happens. Now, you can have some lower level things, like let's say it's about a car. You've got one car and one person needs to go somewhere at a certain time, another person goes somewhere at another time, and each of you want control of that. So even though that's not a high level conflict necessarily, it kind of depends what's at stake, right? It depends what's at stake. What are those incompatible goals that have to do with that car and the ability to have control over the car? All right, so what we want to do is we'll look briefly at a few things that the authors have to say on your notes there. All right, the degrees of conflict on 178. And it's not so much that I want you to memorize these. I think it's just useful to be able to see how these different levels could affect your relationship, right? So that you can ask yourself questions. How is this conflict having an effect on my relationship, whatever that is, in whatever context that relationship is? So, with the first degree, this is on 178, right? First degree is the lowest level. It's a really simple problem, right? It could be that kind of thing happens maybe daily here, like who's going to get to take a shower first, or when, and who's going to be able to do this or that. And so those are, right, pretty low level conflicts. Different points of view kicks it up a notch, because this can be about ideas, beliefs, lifestyles, behavioral choices, right? They're more difficult to resolve. They're more time consuming, and we see those playing out, okay, in lots of different ways as well. So, I mean, you could take any kind of belief situation, again, capital punishment, abortion, etc., that do play out and can be quite complicated and take a very long time to work at resolving. The third degree is a struggle for power. Now, this becomes a little bit different here. So instead of arguing over those different views, right, the fight is now over who's going to be right. It's more about winning. It's more about declaring war against the other party. It's very emotional and intense. And there's really not much of an attempt here to resolve the conflict peaceably. Fourth degree advances that into verbal and physical attacks. Right, and so, and they talk about how the loser may decide to flee or fight, but again, it revolves around power. So these last three do that. The last one is very dangerous. It's the mindset of destroying the enemy no matter what it takes. So again, this can be verbal, it can be physical in these attacks and those, and we need to realize that. What we want to do is keep conflict from escalating to those levels, those last three levels for sure. All right, the next thing they do talk about, and I just made a mention in the note here, the book refers to some of the influences on how we manage conflict, and they talk about some differences between men and women. And they're bringing up chapter 7, things they brought up. I think they might be a little, I think they're being not broad enough in what could affect us, because I think anything from our environment, right, from the transactional model of communication, so anything about our upbringing, and certainly gender has an issue, but and cultural influences, as they talk about too. But I think that they are kind of limiting it a bit too much in their comments there, maybe a little heavy-handed in it, but because again, remember, we're not all cookie cutter human beings, so we do have all kinds of unique ways that define us. Okay, so the next thing they do mention with cultural influences, right, and how those differences between the individualistic and low context versus the high context and collective, right? Because a collective culture, the focus, the priority, right, doesn't mean they don't think about individuals, but the priority is about harmony within the collective. Whereas with an individualistic culture, right, it's more about the individual. So, and I think we can kind of see this play out in some ways with the pandemic as well, in that, some of the protests going on around the country have to do with the lockdown, and the lockdown has to do making that decision. That decision has to do certainly not with economy, but it has to do with people actually contracting this and dying, and trying to keep death to a minimum, so people won't lose their lives. So that as a priority is again something that has to do with us as a whole country, and then. But individualistic freedoms that we all cherish, right, are coming into play as well. And that's what the protests are about. It's like, I've got to be able to take care of myself and my family. I've got to be able to do these things. I've got to get out there. And so you can kind of see all these pressures happening, and our society coping with that. Okay, so types of struggles on page 183. All right. And I do want you to recognize these again. So, the first one they talk about, right, is struggle with self, and that's the conflict that occurs due to internal weakness that keeps you from doing the right thing, making the right decision, causes you to doubt the actions that you take. So this can be tied again to all those things that make up our environment, which is our self, and everything about who we are. It can include personality, experiences, etc. So that's one kind that they talk about, struggle with self. Struggle with another person is when someone points out a flaw in another person, right? Or one person tries to take something away from somebody else. Okay, these are broad, really. Struggle with society, right? Conflict that occurs when one's unsure of the rules for a situation, kind of like what I was just talking about with the protests to open up versus we're not ready to open up the economy and lockdown. So it's where we're unsure, and it can cause you to act incorrectly in that situation. So, and I mean, we've seen this playing out in a variety of ways. Struggle with nature is conflict that occurs when one is threatened by what he or she perceives as a dangerous situation. So some of us may perceive COVID-19 as a very dangerous situation, and some of us may not perceive it that way. So there is a conflict going on with that. So it has to do with that. And certainly we have other things, forces of nature, such as a tornado, etc. And then conflict with the struggle with fate. This occurs when you're faced with forces beyond your control. And again, I guess you could see that playing out somewhat too, because how much do we have control over what's happening is a question, right? It has derailed us in so many ways. And so we are faced, at least to some degree, with these forces that we have this tiny invisible, right, organism that has just completely taken our lives and turned them upside down, and we've lost a lot of people too. But we've had great losses of all kinds, and so we do struggle with that. We do struggle with, and we're going to have lots of different emotions in trying to cope with that. So that struggle when we feel like forces are happening beyond our control. So you should be able to recognize all of these pretty well. And if you don't, you can certainly ask me questions about it. Okay. Now, there are some conflict styles that the authors discuss on pages 184 to 186. And what we're going to do is we're going to subsume those into the conflict styles that I have given to you. Okay. So they do talk about direct aggression, concealed or passive aggression, right? And I think you understand both of those fairly well. Those are on 184 to 186. Sorry. So on, you'll see I think we probably know the first two, right? Aggressive individuals, right? Seem to take no notice of the goals of others. So this is a stance that we're going to see in the conflict styles that I want you to know, okay, on the next page. So this is someone who's aggressive, okay, so this means they'll use any means to get what they want. And so a passive aggression is where they're doing it kind of behind the scenes. There's a lot of manipulation going on, a lot of sneakiness, a lot of, tricks that are played in order to get what you want, so anything goes. So both of those are types of aggression. Passiveness It's again simply, it's really kind of choosing a strategy to not to just allow other people to have their way, to have what they want. And non-assertion is to not stand up for yourself, purposely to choose not to stand up. And then assertion is to stand up for what you think is right or what you think needs to change, etc. in the conflict. Okay, so we're going to, let's see if there's anything else. All right. We want to look at these 5 conflict management styles because these are styles I want you to know, okay? And the survey that you're going to take about yourselves will help you understand these further. We also have, and the book talks about these outcomes as well, and I didn't put that page number in, but you'll see where they talk about, a lose-lose situation or a lose-win or win-lose situation, etc. So we're going to tie all that in here, okay? So avoiding is a lose-lose situation. In other words, lose-lose is the outcome. In other words, if you avoid, okay, this is when you're non-assertively ignoring or staying away. You're purposely doing this. You can do this physically. Stay away from the problem. Steer clear of the person. It could be conversational by changing the subject, or just simply, again, leaving, all right? It's considered usually a lose-lose because nothing's really being resolved. It's only delaying it. And certainly, if you don't take steps, the other person will probably turn to another strategy, such as competing and just taking what they want. So that's the avoiding. Accommodating, right? It's passiveness. This is what I was talking about with their passiveness. It's making a conscious choice to just let somebody else have what they want. This is considered a lose-win, or where if you're the one accommodating, you lose because you're not getting what you want. You're letting somebody else win and get what they want, and that's what it means. So again, and we're going to look at a chart and talk about times when it's appropriate to use it, because there's a time and a place for each one of these. Sometimes avoiding, for example, can keep you out of trouble. Maybe you need to avoid something temporarily because it's a dangerous situation, for example. So sometimes you avoid. Sometimes you avoid because you're too emotional and you need to put it off for the time being. So there's times when it's good to use. Same thing with accommodating. Sometimes it has to do with, okay, I'm going to let you have this because that's the best thing for our relationship. And it also kind of builds up social credit so that when something, maybe it's not as important to you, so you go ahead and accommodate. That's another reason. So, and you can build up social credit and say, remember when I let you have this? Now I'm wondering if you could let me have this. All right. So, accommodating. Again, with avoiding and accommodating, you're both, especially accommodating, you definitely, if you do that too much, you're just going to be a doormat. You're going to be run over. You're going to be taken advantage of if you're too accommodating too much of the time. All right. And certainly if you're avoiding, your relationships are not going to grow if you constantly avoid. And again, you still could be taken advantage of with that as well. Okay, competing. Competing is a win-lose. So the person using the strategies wins and the other people lose. Because this has to do with those aggression types that the book talks about. Direct aggression and passive aggression. Okay. So this means that you are just after what you want, and you're going to do what you got to do to get what you want. You're going to fight for it. Okay. Now, you got to be careful, because you don't want that to really breed these kinds of aggression. Because you can be competitive. You can be competing using that strategy, and still, again, have unconditional positive regard for someone. You could just say, we're going to have to take this route because that's what's going to work the best for us. Because if you're in a place of authority, there are times when you're going to have to make decisions. If you're an administrator, you're going to have to make decisions. And sometimes they're not popular, but you can still have your goals for what's best for everybody. When it turns to aggression, like these two types that we've talked about, that's when it can be damaging to a relationship. So it depends what the situation and the context is. If you're in the military, you're going into battle, guess what? You're going to be using some aggression. Okay, so, and that's appropriate. So we just want to keep that from happening if we can, right? That's what we're talking about. Keep conflict in general, you want to keep at the lowest level possible. So when you're in a conflict, let's say in any kind of hierarchy, say in your employment, you want to start at the lowest level of person that you have the conflict with. And if you're not satisfied and you can't and you want to move up, that's when you move up. Okay. So it's like if you have a disagreement with an instructor about a grade, let's say you start with the instructor. That's the first thing you're going to have to do. Okay. After you have done what you think you could, that's when you move up to, say, the dean, and then you can move on up. So again, you want to keep conflict at the lowest level possible. That's just a hard, fast rule. Okay, for you to be effective. All right, so compromising. Now, some people look at this as a partial lose-lose or a partial win-win. It kind of depends on how you want to look at it. The idea is that both parties are giving something up. So you're not actually getting what you want. You are actually giving something up in some kind of way. So it really kind of depends what's being sacrificed and how you as a party in that conflict are looking at it. Collaborating is a win-win. It's assertive, it's cooperative. This is where they talk about consensus in the book. So you have a high degree of concern for yourselves and others, and you're truly working at finding something where everybody is satisfied, that they don't feel like they've compromised, that they don't feel like they've had to lose anything, okay? So that's a collaborating style, which is the most positive one. It's just not always the right one at the time, okay? And we're going to look at this chart next. So if you look at the chart and you see these factors, okay? So, and again, I've got, where is it? Yeah, partial lose-lose under compromising, but again, some do look at it as a partial win-win. It just kind of depends on the situation. All right, so factors in determining this are the relationship, right? Does the other person have more power than you? Sometimes you have to admit you don't have power in this situation, and you're just going to have to do whatever the rule says you're going to have to do, okay? Whatever that decision is, if you're not the one in power. I didn't, people didn't have individual says. Certainly input was involved, but it's not like everybody that works, at WKCTC got to say exactly what was going to happen and when, because that's not our power to do so. Yes, we definitely have input on those things, but, right? So that's just an example. The situation, right? How important is your goal is going to matter, because sometimes if your goal is not as important this time, it's okay to let somebody else have more of what they want or all what they want. And then later it might help you to get something that's more important to you. All right. And the other person, remember, we can't control another person. We cannot do that. So that means we got to ask these questions. You may want to collaborate, but is the other person willing to collaborate? You can try, but if they're not going to do it, then it's not going to happen, because it does take the parties involved all wanting to do that. Are they willing to compromise? Maybe they're not going to back down. Maybe they're using a competing strategy. You're trying to collaborate, and that's not working. Then you try compromise, and that's not working. All right. So, I mean, you may have to keep moving to other strategies as you respond to this other person, and as you try to communicate with them about what else could be done. All right. And what are your goals? What is it that you want? They need to be clear to you. How important are they? And how important is it to the other person in comparison to you? As I've said before, how much does it matter really? If there's one thing I could definitely change, it would be some of the arguments that the teen siblings have, because they can really argue about the most ridiculous things, and it can go on for a while. And it doesn't really matter. And I know it's sibling rivalry, but I'm hoping that they'll learn that some of those things just aren't worth it. So, okay. So you can look at this chart and realize, right, when is avoiding good to use? When it doesn't really matter. Maybe you just need to stay out of it. Sometimes that's okay. When the costs of the confrontation outweigh the benefits, maybe it's a dangerous situation or you got to cool down. Okay. When is it good to accommodate? Well, sometimes when you just find out, oh, I'm wrong. Okay, let's go ahead and do it your way, because you have just realized it. When the issue is more important to the other person than you, as I said, when the long-term cost of winning isn't worth the short-term goal. Okay, in other words, that's going to damage a relationship because of what you're pushing, what's, being pushed for, and whether you should accommodate or not. So, and to build up credits. In other words, on that long-term, it's not good to fight this battle because there's bigger things at stake. All right, so to build up credits for later conflicts, I've said, to let others learn by making their own mistakes. And, it's that sense like a parent says, okay, just go ahead and do it your way. And we'll see what happens, right? Yes, very famous. I'm sure every parent has done that at some point or many times. Okay, competing. When is it the right time to do, when there's not enough time to seek a win-win outcome? Okay, if sometimes, just like with some of the decisions that's been made with the pandemic, it could be some other kind of urgent situation. There's not time to sit down and discuss everything. Sometimes somebody's got to take charge and make those decisions. Okay. When the issue is not important enough to negotiate at length. Sometimes people can spend a ridiculous amount of time, as I said, sometimes with the teenagers, a ridiculous amount of time, just trying to win, this disagreement, to try to win it, when it's really not important. You've lost all that time and energy on something that really didn't matter, okay, or matter much. It's good to use it when the other person won't cooperate. So you've already tried collaborating, you've tried compromising, you've tried these, and they're just simply not going to cooperate. Then you may have to use competing, right? When you're convinced your position is right and it's necessary, that something has to be done, you're the one that's going to have to make a decision, and you're going to have to do it. And that's something I can get resistance with here. And sometimes I just have to put my foot down and say, this is what's going to happen, and this is why it's going to happen, but it's going to happen, right? All right. To protect yourself against a person who takes advantage of non-competitive people. So again, if you end up with a low score or super low score on competing, you may not be standing up for yourself enough. You may need to try a little more of a competing stance at times when things are important to you. So that's one of those hints there. Compromising, partial lose-lose or partial win-win. To achieve quick temporary solutions to complex problems. Sometimes collaboration takes a lot of time. And so you only want complex, important issues to be done with collaboration. Compromise is a quick fix sometimes because you can come up with that, and maybe it's just temporary until you have time to come up with a better solution where everyone's satisfied. More collaboration can take place. When opponents are strongly committed to mutually exclusive goals. And sometimes nobody's going to back down. If nobody's going to back down, then compromise may have to happen, okay? When the issues are moderately important but not enough for a stalemate, again, if it's not worth time to continue, then compromise, let something go on each side so you're not stuck, okay? So you can move forward. It's a backup mode when collaboration doesn't work, which I've already said, and to come up with creative and unique solutions to problems. So sometimes as compromise, a lot of work in compromise can help. You may not ever be able to reach that collaboration stage, but some very interesting compromises can be created, right? And where people maybe are not completely satisfied, but they are ready and willing to move on in a relationship, and that's okay with them. So collaborating is a win-win. This is, again, you don't want to collaborate over everything because it takes a long time to collaborate. There's much to be considered. So when it's too important, though, for compromise, yes, you're going to have to take the time, and you're going to have to come up with a consensus and so everyone is satisfied. When a long-term relationship between you and the other person is important. So obviously, if this conflict takes place in a marriage, for example, you're going to have to collaborate if this is something that's important to you, right? And the other person's important, you want to keep this relationship going, then you have got to come up with a collaboration, all right? To merge insights with someone who has a different perspective on the problem. So again, collaboration can bring about some really wonderful things. You can, again, when we talked about perception, your perception can be altered in a sense that you know how to encompass those perceptions in a solution to a conflict. All right. So merging your insights with somebody else's insights can be a really fantastic thing to happen. So that's a good reason to do it, to merge your insights. And of course, sometimes I think we've had times during the pandemic where people were merging insights and other times where they're diverging. And sometimes it feels, like there's more chaos going on. Other times it looks like everybody's got a good plan and everybody's working together. All right. So develop a relationship by showing commitment to the concerns of both parties. Right. So in other words, if you need to do that, if you need to make sure you have this strong relationship, okay, that you're showing commitment, that you're both committed to it, that, excuse me, that's what it illustrates. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about with chapter 10.